get started. So first off, I want to thank everybody for coming to the session and thank everybody for attending Triangle InfoSeCon 2020. Today's presentation is by Nathan Smolenski. Nathan is a cybersecurity and technology leader with over 18 years of cybersecurity and technology leadership experience across financial services, insurance, management consulting, and software industry verticals. Prior to joining the NetSkope team, Nathan served as the head of cybersecurity strategy and engineering for the New York Life Insurance Company, as well as the previous CISO roles at Spencer Stuart, Zurich North America, 21st Century Insurance. And with that, Nathan, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you for the introduction, and thanks everybody for coming today. Looking forward to this presentation and your questions. And so really what we're talking about today is going to be focused on zero trust and a delivery model for zero trust, but it's really about sort of transformation and maturing the program that you're building and or managing in a way that's going to enable you to kind of future-proof your security. And really the intent here is to kind of talk about this from a transformational perspective, because obviously, as you all know, there's a lot of crazy transformational kinds of things going on right now, right? And we talk about it a lot in the industry. Like there's been a forced digital transformation on a number of organizations as a result of the pandemic and a lot of other things going on in the world. And as a result, we've done a lot of different things. We've maybe adopted technologies that we didn't traditionally look at or consider. Because we needed a way to return to operations early on, and now we're looking at similar challenges and opportunities from the perspective of adopting technologies to return to the workplace, right? So as we go through this, feel free to send questions in the Q&A, and we can address those as we go through the process of the presentation, and I'll capture those questions and respond to those when we wrap up. So let's get started. So first, as we kind of jump into this, I want to set a couple of contextual items, because this is really kind of the important to kind of get this out of the way. But let's talk about what we already know, right? We know that our applications have moved out of the data center, right? And this is a constant swing that's happening all the time, and probably has accelerated for many organizations. And we also understand that the workplace isn't a place, right? Your employees are looking to work from wherever they want. So they're not necessarily going to be on your corporate network. And for many organizations, that's going to be something that holds true in perpetuity, as opposed to just in a temporary manner. And we know from the consumerization of technology that your users, your employees, they really want to access their applications and data from anywhere, right? So if we're working anywhere, we're going to need the tools that we need to do our day-to-day jobs, to be functional and effective and scalable from wherever we're deciding to work, right? So that's really kind of important as we go through this, because these themes are going to be things that we're going to talk about as we kind of hit through the various sections of this discussion. So obviously we're talking about zero trust today. So let's kind of put the context around what this is, right? So I want to first say it's not a product, right? So there's a lot of marketing FUD and other things out there around this, right? But really, zero trust is a family of architectural principles with the intent of removing the concept of implicit trust, meaning if I'm on your network, you implicitly trust that you know who I am and you know what I'm doing, right? So that is the concept that we're really trying to kind of disrupt. And so as we look at this, really the intent here for technologies that enable these architectural principles, it's really about focusing on the ability to do continuous assessment and to take in contextual data and to constantly analyze the conditions that that are happening with users, with devices, with applications, et cetera, right? All of this being brought together to enable risk-based decision making, right? So that's really what we're trying to do. So it's a whole family of principles. And so when you see things in out in the market, or when people talk about, oh, buy this product, it equals zero trust, we know that's not the case, right? That's a reality that is we've heard this before. It's not the first time we've heard these kinds of things. So it's just kind of cutting through that fog a little bit to really kind of get down to the brass tacks of what this looks like, right? And now let's kind of get a little further into the process. So we often talk about zero trust as being a contradictory approach. And I love these cartoons that Rich Powell and Ed Amoroso put together for Tag Cyber. Obviously Rich is a phenomenal artist and cartoonist, right? So I love this one particularly because you got these two guys saying, yeah, we've implemented zero trust. And one of the guys is like, I don't believe you. And so clearly that's the challenge, right? But when you think about it from the perspective of this cartoon, this really is what the challenge is. We're saying zero trust as if to not trust anything, right? Well, if we don't trust anything, there isn't any way to communicate, right? It's like having two machines that are turned off just sitting next to each other and considering that to be zero trust, right? So obviously there's more to it, and there's a lot more detail sort of under the covers that I hope we will be helpful in going through today. So what is a zero trust principle, right? So we touched on this, but really these architectural principles there's many of them, but really the effect of them is that understanding that implicit trust has to be removed for us to be able to minimize the risk of providing that implicit trust, right? So it doesn't really matter how we go about doing it, right? It could be an ecosystem of technologies, but the base principles are really intent on defining that the inside of the network and the outside of the network need to be treated essentially the same, right? And this really goes along with the erosion of the perimeter, right, in the traditional sense, right? When we talk about castles and moats like we used to build for many, many, many years, right? It's not to minimize the effectiveness of those. It's really to say that, that concept is great for protecting the data center. But that concept gets a little squirrely and a little interesting when you start thinking about the resources that we access and the things that we use as service providers aren't always necessarily in the data center, right? So we have to start thinking about how do we start to move our security to where our data is actually going, and really kind of put the user back into the center of the universe, right? Whereas right now, in a historical sense, if you think about it, it's really been the data center has been the center of the universe, and we've tethered everything to that, right? And we really kind of got to invert that concept and think about what that looks like going forward. So let's talk about some of the things from a business perspective that are supporting from a zero trust. What is zero trust, right? So we have to look at it as a business enabler, right? So when we talk about security programs and security teams enabling business, this is not a common thing. Security teams often are looked at as the department of no. But really what we're really trying to communicate here is that this can be an enabler. It can actually accelerate the adoption of new technologies for your business. It can accelerate, go-to-market strategies for business, a lot of things, right? So this is really the concept of your security team kind of like playing the brakes on a race car, allowing your business to go as quickly and as fast as they possibly can, but having just enough steering and brakes to make it around the racetrack without actually crashing, right? So, and so as we think about that as a backdrop, right, it is a marriage of process and technology, as you'll see as we go through this. It's also a strategy to reduce complexity. Some of the things that we've been doing over the years has been buying point solutions to solve these little problems, and that's created this ecosystem of stuff that ultimately becomes a liability from a technical debt perspective long term, right? So it's something to think about as we go through this. Data and context really become the key points of how to introduce these principles and make them effective. And it's because of that, it's this whole concept of zero trust is contextual and dynamic in nature, right? You have to be able to kind of see the changing sands and the different things that are going on, in an adaptive way. So now let's talk about what it isn't, right? And this is, again, looking at it from a business and technology perspective. This isn't something that's a quick win, right? So you'll see that as we go through this, there's a lot of table stake items here that we're going to talk about that you should be doing today, right? And these are always those things that we always come back to. It's like, wow, I wish I had an inventory of everything. These are the same concepts that we've been talking about forever. And we have to really think about getting really good at those to be able to implement these kinds of strategies. Again, I'm going to harp on this a little bit, but it is not a product, right? So zero trust is not a thing, right? So it's really a combination of things and processes, and it's really an ecosystem, right? And it's not just for identity and network technologies, right? They play a role conceptually, but it's as standalone items, it's not really, it really isn't going to provide that for you. And this isn't an idea, as we've talked about, where trust is removed completely. Go back to that concept of, well, you can't just have two things that are turned off, sitting next to each other and claim that that's zero trust, because those two things aren't communicating. And this isn't some sort of one-off or IT only centric project, right? I mean, this isn't something that is just going to be like, oh, let's go stand up zero trust. That's not what it is. And it's definitely not a next gen perimeter, as you sometimes might hear as well. So let's talk about starting the actual journey, because this is a journey. And again, we'll touch on some of those table stakes, right? But a lot of these things, as you'll see, really are things that we've been talking about for really a long time. So before we jump into this, there's really three big questions that I want to pose for you to think about as we go through the rest of the presentation. First is, do I have visibility and control over cloud or application service from one real central technology with a single pass inspection? Meaning I don't have to send my traffic through 10 appliances or to fork traffic off into different technologies to inspect and understand the contextual elements of that traffic. And do I have a way to enforce policies for the data that I have in motion and at rest, right? So that's a big question. The second one is, can I inspect and apply policy without actually hairpinning traffic to a data center, thus realizing performance and experience benefits of cloud services? It's a great question. That's really where some of these challenges are that we'll talk about today are hiding. And lastly, can I provide risk-based conditional access to data, leveraging user behaviors, user context, device context, application characteristics, and data classification? And am I able to apply these new policies if these conditions change, right? So kind of the concept of being able to look at a situation and determine if, the contextual elements around that concept have changed and be able to adapt my policy, to be able to manage that. So some things to consider, with those questions in mind, some things to consider before you're even considering looking at implementing, the zero trust principles and concepts. The first thing, and this is a really important one, is you have to architect this with your business in mind first, right? There's a great deal of sort of background information that is necessary to make this effective, right? If you're a security organization and you don't have that relationship with the business, it's a great opportunity to continue to kind of build that and explain to the business that, look, we can help to accelerate some of the things you want to do in the business, but we have to have a better, strategic mapping to what you're trying to accomplish, right? So this is an opportunity to really take a step back and understand from an inventory perspective, what are the things that we're going to invest in from a business perspective? What are the most critical applications? Do we know that stuff? Right? And that gets into understanding your technology stack, your processes, what capability gaps that you might have, right? And this is everything from your application landscape to your user landscape to the device landscape. Having those inventories are absolutely critical, because then you can start to classify those inventories, right? And that really gets into then bringing you to understanding your threats and risk, right? So if you have these table stakes, like understanding your inventories, understanding the background of, the user population, what applications do users use versus which ones do they not? What is the importance of those people? What is the importance of a given application from a criticality perspective or an availability perspective? It really starts to give you that risk landscape so you can get an understanding and actually put that to use, right? Because what you're really doing is you're feeding all of this contextual information. It's like feeding it into a risk engine. And we're going to talk about that, but it's really critical to understand some of these basic table stakes, which we all should be doing anyway, right? You can't necessarily secure what you don't know about. And lastly, it's the end user requirements, right? So going back to the business, right? What is it that the users actually are trying to do, and what do they need to do? What is the expectations and outcomes that they're trying to accomplish with their roles, their jobs, the applications they use? So we have to have some level of transparency and understanding into how these things are impactful to the user community, which ultimately impacts your business. So if we think about this as a path to implementing these principles, there's kind of a process that you can follow, right? So we'll touch on some of the things we just talked about, but really first we got to start with that basic table stake. What are our information assets, and do we understand them both from a sensitivity perspective and a criticality perspective? Like, what are the most sensitive and critical things that I need, or that my users need, my business needs, from an application perspective, from a device perspective, maybe it's infrastructure perspective, et cetera, right? Those all tend to be inputs into this process. And then you need to dig into the user population that will require access, right? And this goes a lot deeper than just saying, I know who my users are. Really what we're trying to accomplish here is to understand that I know who they are, right? And I have an inventory of them. but I also want to understand which ones are accessing which applications, right? And so that requires you to then kind of map these users in a way that you understand what are the requirements for the roles that they play, and the jobs that they fill. And it allows you to then identify the applications that you want to expose in this type of an architecture, right? So if you have certain things that are, much more sensitive and only a few users use those, maybe those are the last applications that you start to expose from a technology perspective. That would allow you to gain the biggest benefit, right? So we want to start with the simple things, right? If you think about it, if you classify all of your applications, maybe there's something like an intranet site that you haven't necessarily exposed outside publicly, and you want to figure out a way to just expose that to all of your users, right? Everybody has the same right to that application, but maybe you just don't want to expose it to the public. That's an example of how you might look at this. And then you need to understand and start grouping these business user populations to all of those core applications, right? So having the inventories of all of these items allows you to kind of come up with the schema that says, okay, I understand that this group of operators uses this group of applications, and then we need to determine how best to implement the controls to enable the access to the applications and the underlying data. And that's where technology comes into play. So a lot of this stuff is really just capturing information that provides inputs to developing the process. The second piece here is really around then defining the rules for access, right? So once you've got this mapping of sorts created, you really need to start thinking about what the rules and the roles are, right? You might need a CRUD matrix of some sort, right? But starting with these coarse-grained controls and using basically hierarchies of information asset ratings, you can start to map all of this stuff together. And that way you can start thinking about, do I have to have escalated or elevated controls in certain situations for certain users that are accessing certain kinds of data, depending on where they are, the types of devices that they're using, et cetera, right? So it allows you to start bringing together a really, important and impactful set of information that informs the process. And then really the next step there is defining those differentiated controls, right? So as you start to map all of this, you're going to see that there will be certain use cases and certain users with applications and data that will fall out of those kind of standard approaches that you've been using. And you'll say, look, these are the riskiest users, applications, and now you can really start to put those differentiated controls or think about how they might need to be implemented for that specific population of users and applications. And then we need to implement controls in the form of policies, right? So this is where technology comes into play. First, you're just kind of mapping all of this information out, but now you have to think about, how do I then apply these controls into a form of a policy that can be applied within the technology platforms that are available for me to do this, right? And that really starts thinking about, how do I, in a very smart and efficient and scalable way, take all of this data and feed it into like a risk engine, which enables me to ultimately make decisions, right? Because you've now done the hard work of collecting all this information. Now you have to put it to work. And after you kind of get to that point, you start implementing those policies and controls, you really can then start taking a look at the other ways that you've gained access, the traditional remote access solutions that maybe you have used in the past, or even just identity solutions that you have used in the past, and start thinking about deprovisioning or revoking access to those more traditional solutions, right? Unless obviously you need them for a specific use case. When you start thinking about implementing the technology aspects of zero trust principles, that then you can start deprovisioning the things that can no longer follow those principles or no longer be able to actually meet them. So when you think about this architecture in a concept, right, we talked about all these contextual elements, right? You've got data, you're going to have identities, you're going to have application context, device context, behaviors of users and devices, and geographic contextual things, right? So when you think about all of these, right, these are all vectors of risk. And so if you bring all of these vectors of risk together from a data perspective and you inject those into a risk engine that can make decisions on it, now you've got the ability to develop risk-based adaptive policies that allow for authorization and access management to certain things based on that context, right? So this becomes like this continuous assessment process, right? Where you're continuously sending data into the risk engine to make decisions based and then execute those decisions based on the policy. So if we had a policies that's set up in one way and the risk engine decides that that context that it's receiving for a given user and application combination is change to in a way that is providing, less control or more risk, then maybe that policy needs to take a different action. And really that's the intent here, right? So every time something is happening, we're constantly looking at the context of the situation and adapting the behaviors of the policy to grant or deny or step up access to a given application or service. So when you think about this in a scalability or maturity scale, right, this is a way to kind of look at adaptive trust. So you'll have trust levels from an access, activity, identity, an endpoint perspective, or an application perspective, right? So these could be those inputs. And then you may have on one side of the one side of the scale, something as simple as social media, right? And how your organization might look at that. And as you go to the far right side of the scale, you have a much higher expectation around what are the requirements to access things like HR data, board materials, maybe large databases, or highly sensitive information from a classification perspective, right? So you can see how you can implement these adaptive trust levels across the various elements within your organization. And obviously this isn't like a one size fits all. You're going to have to define those based on your own view, but this is an example of how you can start to think about these challenges. And so when we think about sort of the benefits of going through this exercise, really what we're trying to do is decrease risk, right? You're trying to reduce the amount of risk. If you think about how we've traditionally done things, right? If I am on the network and I'm, being implicitly trusted, I can kind of do a lot of different things, right? How many are really that good at doing isolation and segmentation, on the network or within the data center? It's challenging to do, right? So without some of those additional controls or those additional layers, right, there's a lot of potential for lateral movement, right? So that's one of the things that's a benefit. We're also, through this process, predefining the application and resource access, right? You're putting governance around how you get to things or how you're able to access things and what are the requirements for you. It's like a set of keys that you can apply to an individual or a machine to enable them to either access things or not access things, right? So this is getting into the concepts of really providing conditional least privilege access. And that's really the basis for all of this, right? These are concepts that we've had forever, but it's just putting them into practice now and actually enabling them to inform a process. This also can gain, and provide a ton of visibility within your environment, right? Because the delivery mechanisms to do this effectively, from the risk engine to the visibility needed to provide all of that context, right? There's going to be an ecosystem of technologies that kind of bring all of that together. And so with that, you'll gain so much more insight into what's actually going on in your environment, not just from an access perspective, but from a threat perspective or from a behavior perspective, et cetera, and allows you to focus on those things individually if needed. And then ultimately, you're enabling the ability for risk-based decision-making at scale, right? We can, in traditional environments, we might have been able to do risk-based decision-making with some limited data, right? But really, this is about bringing together an ecosystem of data to provide that as an input into a process. So let's talk about the delivery mechanism for Zero Trust. And some of you may have heard about SASE, the Secure Access Service Edge. And this really is sort of the wave of the future in terms of how security will be delivered as a service. And it's really the merger or convergence of network as a service and security as a service. And you'll see that this is really conceptually important to being able to bring together all of that context we talked about and actually use that as an input into technologies and as an input from technologies to make that risk engine something that is possible. So let's talk about SASE and the importance of it. The first thing we want to talk about is really around the data, right? And this is something that we have to be realizing, right? Data flows like water and seeks to be free. So the concept here is, we have to understand that we're always going to have data making its way out there, right? And being able to cover all of those angles as to where it goes is a big part of this, right? So this is a transformational piece that we have to consider. And it's really important what SASE and Zero Trust as concepts and architectures will bring is a big change in how we have to look at things, right? So we have all of this contextual data. We need to put that to action. But the main goal really about all of this is basically to move your security to where your data is going, right? So if water's going everywhere, data is going everywhere, we need to make sure that we have controls that also are everywhere and more representative of our operating environment today. So let's think about this contextual ecosystem in the form of like the human body, right? And if you think about all of these things as the senses, right? Our app risk, activity awareness of a user, threats that may be available, identities, networks and devices, user behaviors, all of these things are like the senses. These are all the contextual elements of zero trust that we've been talking about. The challenge here is how do we actually, where does that risk engine live? And ultimately, that's what the brain is. So SASE really is the brain. It is the risk engine. It's the thing that's going to both serve as an input from a contextual perspective, from an ecosystem of products, but it's also going to have its own context that it's able to capture from the various services that it provides, right? So the secure access service edge is serving as the brain within this ecosystem to pull together that context and actually enable the risk engine to run and be effective, right? So this is the delivery mechanism for how you can deliver the actual zero trust experience in a way that is contextually rich and effective. So let's talk a little bit more about the secure access service edge and really what this convergence of sorts looks like. And so we talked about the fact that, SASE as a concept is really kind of the merger or convergence of security as a service and network as a service. So on the right, we have sort of these representative stack of things. And you could essentially imagine these stacks of capabilities as like the boxes in your data center, right? Each of those boxes provides a certain kind of capability or service. And you want to be able to ultimately use those services in the right use cases. That's really hard to do in boxes that weren't intended to speak to each other, right? So the concept here is to abstract those capabilities and services and build them into software, right? Similar to what SD-WAN has done for networking, right? Where you actually have software deriving how a network functions and works. It's the same thing with security services. So abstracting those capabilities of inspection and SSL decryption and all of the various things that we're doing in our data center and putting those into a software platform and enabling that to integrate with the network capabilities that are also now software based, right? So bringing security as a service and network as a service together to really shift away from the data center and move it more to where your data is actually going. It's not to minimize the data center. It's just to say that that can't be the only inspection point that you have. And this is how context becomes king, right? So this is where all of that data can be brought together to make and understand informed risk-based decisions. So let's talk again a little bit about context. So if you look at the use cases that we have here, right? So you can see at the top, this is really kind of the zero trust concept in a contextual form. And these are all the contextual data elements that really, when we think about a SASE architecture that you're bringing together natively, right? So you're going to have user context. We talked about that. In this case, we know who the user is. We know where they work from some group information. We are even going to understand the credentials that they're using. We're going to have some context about their device. Is it a managed device or personal device? We're going to have some context about the applications that they're using, right? What is the application? What is the category of that application, right? In this case, we're talking about box.com. Is that an unmanaged or managed app? Meaning, is this something that belongs to the company I work for, or is this something that's personal for Pat Smith? We need to be able to determine that. And that gets into the application instance, right? Understanding which instance of Office 365 we're using, or Box, or any of those services. And then getting into the application risk. Remember, I talked about vectors of risk, and application risk is one of them. So when we look at application risk, we look at scoring applications from a supplier governance perspective, the same that you would in your organization. They're really trying to look at, does this company have a SOC 1, SOC 2? What's their privacy policy look like? What are the security standards and policies that they abide by and follow, et cetera? Have they been breached? All of these elements being brought together to give you a picture of risk for an application with a score. Same thing from a URL perspective. So if you're going to the web, you're browsing the web, you need to be able to understand the categorization and all of the things that go along with that for the things that are just general web applications. Then we need to look at activities, right? So this is really getting into what the user can do in the application. Are they able to upload, create, or edit, or delete? All of those activities allow you to then enable decision-making on activities based upon what is real for that application, as opposed to just understanding that a user went to an application and some data potentially left the building. Then we have to look at the user risk rating, right? So this goes back to understanding the context about the user, right? So this kind of gets into the UEBA space, where you're saying, is this behavior, this activity that the user is doing in this service with this level of risk on the application, is this something that's normal? And then we have to look at it from a threat perspective. So based on the activity, are we either bringing some type of malware or a threat into our environment as a result of a user's activity, or are we taking something that might be infected and actually moving it to another environment, right? So understanding that threat context. And then we have to have that data context as well. And what we really are looking at there is just really understanding the data, right? We talked about classification, criticality, all of those things being brought together from the perspective of how do I understand what this data is, and do I want to allow this action based upon all of these other inputs that I have. And then at the end, is the risk engine saying, okay, the policy now gets to be enforced, right? Do I allow this? Do I coach the user to use an alternative? Am I concerned? And do I encrypt this data, etc.? Whatever policy actions are available, this is where the actual decision making or all those inputs get brought together, right? And if you look at the bottom half of the screen here, really what we're trying to articulate here is if you think about your legacy egress technologies, right? We might have some really basic context, but it's not enough to really make a fully informed decision, especially on the activity front, right? You might get very basic things. Or you're viewing something, or maybe you've done an upload or a get or a put has happened, but we really don't have any context for what's happening. Limited, we'll have some threat context. You'll have some limited data protection context. But again, at the end of the day, you're limited in how you can effectuate a policy action with this kind of information. So what we want to look at from a context perspective is think about each of these contextual items as a decision tree, right? So here's all these various items, brought together, and this is really what the risk engine is looking for from an input perspective. And as all of these inputs come into the risk engine, that risk engine has to be able to then take that context, as we just spoke about, and actually effectuate the policy outcome, right? And so if we look at that in the perspective of a use case, we actually have this use case of a user trying to get to salesforce.com, and this is the SASE architecture instantiating services both from a networking and security perspective based on context. And so we have a salesperson that's remote on a corporate laptop going to Salesforce, right? So this whole concept of getting you to where you need to go, whether it be in your data center or into the cloud, it becomes really important because you've now normalized your approach to allowing or enabling this access, right? It's not a bunch of different technologies, working in silos. It's technologies, an ecosystem of technologies working together to normalize this process, right? So this is a great use case example of how these services can be instantiated, and you can see that this could serve many permutations of use cases that you may have in your environment. So what you really need to think about when you think about all of this that we just talked about is that brain, or that process, is really just a giant engine with lots of moving parts, right? So again, going back to the concept of this is not a single use kind of tool. It's not a single thing. It's a lot of different elements being brought together. So this engine really represents, this is a complicated ecosystem, but it can be done and it can be simplified over time. And that's really one of those key elements of this whole process, is looking at what you're doing today and simplifying and aligning to platforms that can provide the service for you and operate like this engine behind the scenes so that you have better simplified outcomes. So now let's talk about a journey to maturity from a zero trust perspective. So given everything we spoke about, there's a lot of things that you can look at when it comes to how to mature that, right? You might not be at the beginning stages. You could be somewhere in the middle. You might still be working on building those inventories and really understanding and classifying your own data. There's a lot of different things, and people are all in different places in terms of how they're transforming their programs and really aligning to their business strategies. So let's talk a little bit about some of the things that you can consider here. So one of the things that we've kind of built over time is really this kind of 5-step implementation strategy. And this is less about the low level detail and really about the high level table stakes that we kind of talked about before, right? So that discover phase is around what we just talked about at the beginning. What are those contextual elements? What does my company actually need? How do I know my assets? Do I know my users? Do I know my apps, right? So that deliverable is all about building that, right? Those are the table stakes that we've been talking about forever, SANS top 20 kind of stuff, right? The next phase is really the prioritization of that. So then taking all of that data that you've established and mapped and then determining the prioritization around that. So the riskiest users, the most critical apps, the most sensitive data. Let's put the prioritization around all of that information and then use that as an input. And then we have to actually start to put the controls in place, right? So as you're looking at the technologies that might be available for this, there's lots of things out there that can be brought together in an ecosystem, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. But when you start thinking about that, it's really about starting to bring those coarse-grained controls in, implementing enforceable policies that can be applied in the most simplest manner, like we talked about earlier in the presentation. And then as you get further down the risk scale, looking at the differentiated controls, right? Starting to think about those high-risk users and all of that stuff and actually putting that into practice. Then you want to get into the education piece, right? Really working with your business to educate users, removing old ways of doing things and educating your users on why this change is necessary. Because at the end of the day, ultimately, this is a benefit for the user as well, right? You're removing friction of very, very old school binary controls and draconian approaches to doing security. And you're really starting to then, enable the user to work like they're used to working from a consumer perspective. And then, really thinking about, again, informing users. This is reporting exposures to data owners, right? Things that you discover as you go through this process where you're seeing broken processes and different business challenges, right? This is why that strategy of aligning with your business strategy is so critical. And then last is really, really about governing and making that governance piece a continuous assessment process, right? Understanding the data, understanding the changes to the data, being able to measure risk and look for improvements to buy down that risk, right? Looking for investments that can actually reduce risk. Looking for changes in high profile, high risk issues, right? Understanding that, your user population may change. You may have bought a cloud service at one point that didn't have sensitive data in it, and now your business has decided to put sensitive data in it. That's the kind of change that you need to be able to adapt to, because otherwise you may have approved that application or service from a supplier governance perspective, and now it's not meeting the letter of the law. So you need to be able to be adaptable. And really this comes into the form of really building this as a continuous assessment model, constantly looking back and challenging yourselves from the beginning. Has my discovery been effective? Do I need to go back and look more? Do I need to go back and look deeper, further? So then we talk a little bit about maturity, right? And if you think about those steps that we just had, right, this is really kind of the scale of maturity. And if you were to start this process, you probably are going to be in that initial stage, right? This is really kind of understanding, the various visibility elements and contextual elements. And this is kind of like the, level 0. This is the basic stuff. So as you start to undertake the various steps that we talked about in this plan, you'll be able to kind of scale yourselves or your organization into one of these categories, right? And the goal obviously is to get the optimized, but how quickly you get there and for what applications and what users and what data, it may take time, right? There may not be a need to get all the way to optimize for everything, right? There may be less of a need for that. But the challenge here is really, getting started becomes the biggest challenge, right? The data and all of the mapping and all of those table stakes that we've been talking about throughout the presentation, those are the things that are really the hard work. And most people have been working on this for some time, but it just highlights the importance of those table stakes in terms of moving forward. So when you think about the whole SASE model that we talked about, there's also a conceptual way to look at the technology adoption, right? So if we're starting at level 1 here, there's a variety of ways to approach this, but this is a common one that we see in the industry and with people that we advise or that I advise, right? So it's kind of looking at this in 2 different ways. So when you're looking at that delivery mechanism for zero trust, you're looking at the ecosystem of technologies that go with it. One place that people often start, because there's an opportunity for consolidation and simplification, like we talked about, is to move to a cloud-based secure web gateway, right? So your egress technology, move that away from the traditional appliance-based solutions in your data center, and think about the cost savings that you get with that, right? You're getting SSL decryption at scale, so you can get rid of those appliances. You're getting rid of the legacy secure web gateway appliances, the subscriptions that go with it, all of the other economics around that. You might have also had a traditional CASB mechanism that you could also consolidate in that form as well, right? Ones that are solely looking at the cloud from an API perspective only, right? So there's an opportunity for really kind of core inspection points and moving to sort of a new perimeter, right? And so this is the opportunity to kind of place that first foothold to moving everything to more adaptive. right? The next piece is really using all of those features, functions, and capabilities from that next gen SWG and start building more contextual elements into the process, right? And this again allows you to start to consolidate. So replacing DLP appliances, sandboxing solutions, potential UEBA appliances, again, savings and consolidation to simplify the environment. And then there's the next step here is really to look at the network access, right? So start thinking about how do we bring zero trust network access, so principles for zero trust being imported into network access. Like, how do we actually do this, right? Are we able to integrate with our identity providers and potentially our SD-WAN if we have that technology? This allows you to start looking at consolidating those legacy VPN concentrators and all of the technology that goes with it, right? So you're starting to think about enabling a true, zero trust access to the applications and data and resources that we have. And then you can also, take it to the next step further and start thinking about those egress appliances in the data center. Do we still need those? There's going to be the case that in many cases you're going to still have that data center and you're going to still need some of that stuff, but it's just not going to be as necessary or as big or as a big a part of your infrastructure footprint as it used to be, right? So there's no wrong or right way to go through this. The realization that you have to go through this process is probably the only thing that has to happen. You certainly could start with trying to reduce risk from a network access perspective first, and then go to the secure web gateway and start bringing in the additional context. But this is a very logical path that many of our customers and prospects have gone through into understanding what this really looks like in practice. And so when we think about this, our next new normal in cybersecurity, right? If we look at the left-hand side of the screen, it's our traditional or a hybrid environment where we're trying to do these things in a more traditional way, hairpinning or backcalling traffic. But the reality is that our future architecture, really that move to the future architecture really becomes the thing that's going to help transition our businesses to a more future-proofed environment, right? So it's being able to bring back and bring in all of that context, the user behavior, the zero trust principles, integrating that with your software defined perimeter and start really doing intelligent policy enforcement, right? And making decisions based upon that continuous assessment model that we've talked about. And so where are we heading, right? So we talked about the transition. What this really represents, this simple architecture here is if you could simplify your environment down to kind of core platforms that can provide this information. Not to say that we don't need lots of other tools for things like application security, et cetera, but if you're really just looking and starting from scratch, these become the key aspects, right? Think about that human body, right? So where are all the places that we can get the context from, right? Where we need identity, right? That we need mechanisms to be able to do risk-based authentication and single sign-on and MFA and all of those things, right? So identity becomes a core piece of this. We need to have the context of the endpoint, right? We need elements. We need to be able to exchange information with those elements. We need to be able to understand, is this managed? Is it not? All of that context that comes from those endpoints. Then we need to be able to automate this, right? So, if we're going to solve the employment problem in cybersecurity, we need to be able to do as much automation as possible and to really make this a simple thing so that your critical resources that you have to spend on security are focused on the most important things. We want the robots to do the boring stuff, right, at the end of the day. And that secure access cloud or that SASE architecture, that brain has to kind of sit in the middle of all of these platforms to enable these platforms to get you to all of those service providers that you need, right? It has to be the risk engine to ingest all of this data and provide its own context to enable that risk-based decision-making to happen, right? So whether we're going to the web or software as a service or infrastructure as a service, back to our data center or into a branch office location, it doesn't matter. We want to treat this the same across the board. And so some cold hard facts and things that we want to talk about here as we're coming towards the end of the presentation, right? So why SASE and zero trust now, right? What's the big deal, right? So we all talk about digital transformation, but at the end of the day, to actually transform, we need to have agile security. It's got to be scalable. It's got to be fast. It has to be something that is, really built to enable the business, right? I mean, we haven't really done this traditionally, right? So SASE and zero trust are fundamental for security transformation, which has to happen for a business to do digital transformation effectively. Another fact is that that stack, the things that we've been using for all of these decades really needs to be simplified, right? We have to reduce operating costs. We've been asking for money forever. We really haven't gone back and said, hey, look, we can save you a lot of money by just being a little more intelligent about how we effectuate change in our environment. And so it's really about being able to reduce costs and provide a consistent approach across all of our parameters for our application stack, and having controls that are not so draconian and binary in nature, right? Allowing more flexibility for users to operate as best that they can from wherever they're working. And then lastly, we have to understand and really make a concerted effort to understand that forcing users back to a data center for inspection and control for all the other things that are out on the web and in the cloud is not a benefit, right? This is an inhibitor to organizational growth and acceleration of transformation. It's not enabling, and this is sort of the limitations that we've placed on ourselves and our businesses for a long time. And we have to get out of our own way and start to have that realization. It is a little bit of letting go, but we have to be able to do it if we're going to operate in this way. And at the end of the day, the intent here is really to ensure that the security controls are in line. We're following our data and our users everywhere they go, from whatever device, whatever application, whatever geography they're trying to access. And so our key takeaways here, the biggest thing is we know that data is no longer on a computer we own, and on the application or endpoint is no longer on a network we own, right? So the whole concept of implicit trust from that traditional context, it really becomes we have to adapt to something new, right? So number one, that SASE strategy. So it really coming to the realizations that the hub and spoke model, the MPLS cloud model, is dead, right? We were moving away from that. It's not minimizing the importance of the data center. It's just saying that the data center is not the only service provider that we have. So this whole concept of SASE is going to be extremely disruptive to network and network security architectures as we move more and more in this direction, right? Think of the impact that IaaS had to the traditional data center operating environment, right? That's really what this is all about. The egress technology, right? Our secure web gateway. There's a huge shift happening right now to the cloud. It started with simple things like let's just let somebody else manage it. But the reality here is we need to be able to have these technologies that have the functionality and context that include things like cloud access security brokers and data protection technologies and all those things in one place, in one unified solution, so that they talk to each other and they can share that information that's relevant with the whole approach of being able to use context as part of the risk engine. And then the zero trust model is changing to a continuum of trust, right? So always understanding that whatever a user is doing, whatever application they're accessing from whatever device is constantly changing, right? So we have to be able to adapt to the changes that the user is bringing into the environment. And this is absolutely critical. And these pieces, right, the whole approach of the SASE architecture and strategy, the concept of moving technologies to the cloud to deliver from the edge, and the concepts of zero trust being brought together really become those three large takeaways that we need to address. And as we talked about today, there's a lot of steps and approaches that we can take to do that. And many of them are things that we've been doing for a long time and we should be pretty good at. So as you start thinking about this in the future, this really is an opportunity for you to kind of take the hard work that you put into understanding those inventories and all of that context that we spoke of, and use that for a much better outcome as a vehicle for technology to be much more adaptive in nature.
Hey, Nathan, sorry
that,
to interrupt, but we have 10 minutes remaining.
Thank you. Yeah, and with that, I just wanted to thank everybody today, and happy to take any questions that you may have as we sit here and for the last few minutes. Always happy to have spicy questions too. All right, I have one question here. What is the hardest part of implementing zero trust? Well, I think the hardest part, I'll always go back to the stuff that we talked about as the table stakes, right? Because those of us that are practitioners know that those inventories and all of those things that we talk about as having to be critical to the basics of a security program, those things are not easy, right? They're hard. It's hard to get an understanding of what is the inventory of all the services that I have. It's hard enough to do that in a data center, let alone understanding all of the potential cloud services that are operating in your environment. So there are approaches to do that, and there certainly are technologies that can help with that. But really, I would say that those table stakes, getting those things right, and getting the buy-in from the business, so partnering to because you're going to need the business to be able to to help with some of this, right? So there's that whole idea of being able to map users to to applications, to criticality, to data, all of that stuff. Getting all of that stuff done really becomes the biggest challenge. And obviously being able to do it in a way that you're able to implement the right controls ultimately becomes a technology selection challenge. But I think those table stakes are probably the most critical and obviously the most arduous of any journey like this. Yes, we have another question. It says, it looks like there are several legacy security tools that are replaceable with a SASE architecture and with implementing zero trust. Do you have more information on a cost analysis? I do. We do this consistently for prospects and customers of NetSkope, but our EMEA CISO, Neil Thacker, and myself have written a series of blog posts on the economics of transformation. And in that series, we actually have a really good example of a global organization with 20 locations and numerous employees. And really, what we did was a cost and economic analysis of all of the potential consolidation things, right? So this analysis takes into account things like, are you moving from MPLS to SD-WAN, right? So there's a huge amount of cost savings in that sort of approach, right? And then start thinking about all of the other infrastructure that you have. And so we can make sure that those blog posts are sent out to the attendees today, and you can kind of read through how we think about sort of the economics of transformation and actually see the example. It's an anonymized example from a customer that shows sort of the potential for savings, and it's pretty substantial over the period of 3 to 5 years from that perspective. So happy to provide that. We'll make sure that the organizers get that information and can ship that out. Any other questions?
Hey, we got about 5 minutes remaining.
Okay, thank you. Any last questions before we wrap? All right. Well, if we don't have any other questions, again, I want to thank everyone for coming today, and appreciate the questions that we have. And if there are follow-ups, you can email us at CSO@netscope.com. This is our global chief strategy office, where all of our executive advisors are part of this team. So we're happy to answer anything that you think of, secondarily, or if you're looking for research or information on any of the concepts that we talked about today. Certainly reach out at that email address, and we can provide those materials or links to that information.
All right. Well, I want to thank you both, Nathan and Kim, and NetSkope for coming and doing this. I think that was an excellent presentation, and I certainly enjoyed it, learned a lot. If anyone has any additional questions, or if you guys want to chat, greet, meet, we do have chat rooms and lobbies set up over on BFairs, and you can go by and take a look at the NetSkope booth. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.